This session is called Anthropocene, which is the title of my book, new book. And it's on climate change, contagion, and consolation. It was a book that I wrote during the lockdown, during the pandemic. But we'll see two films which are related to the topic. One of them is called Prayer Flag, which was used as a prologue by Shobna Narayan in her wonderful production called Shunyata. So you'll see that because it has elements of geography, terrain, and climate. And then there's another little film, poetry film we'll see, and then we'll...
Om Tadam Shvam Shau Varaniyo Jyotish Kumbhasya Dhimahi Krutam Bhavyam Hi Bhavaya Om Gayatri Divyai Namaha.
Padme hum, oh, the jewel in the lotus. 1. Manas Sarovar, Mount Kailash. Frayed, flapping in the high winds, prayer flags gently unravel. Homage to the day's first light. But today the dawn is not as bright, though heavy, brooding, silver grey like the lake's shimmering glass top. No one is here except for a woman staring far away, wrapped in her sanctity of continuous linen, her own sari like a prayer flag, though devoid of any colour. She isn't mourning or crying, just gazing fixedly into the water's changing glimmer as the sky's wet weight and the shore's rocky line meet, their edges meanderingly melting into the lake itself. I stood far behind her, behind everything she saw. She was only an accidental figure in the widescreen frame. Unlike her, I was looking skywards through the prayer flag's translucent cotton, counting each thread of each piece of cloth that wove private stories whispered only to me. Weather-worn, strung across canted multiple horizons, I tried to map their own geographies, each an island, each with its own terrain, texture, inscription, and scripture. Found on the highest points on land, as close to the sky as is possible, these magic carpets, shapes caught on an unintentional clothesline, were more meaningful to me than this vast monastic scenery. How each flag, each one must have preserved secrets that only their owners knew. How each a talisman exuded safety and calm, shrouding away grief for the briefest while when one forgets everything, real, imagined, and just dreams. My own piece of cloth that I once tied onto this line wasn't visible to me now. But that did not matter. I found strength in this procession of private passion, in these flags' lack of starch or hierarchy. Their stories passed down by one flag to another, toggled hand in hand through time and age, just like my pet yellow butterfly who infused each flower in my garden with the gift of life without any show or fair. I like the transparent quiet here. I also like the wind's occasional sound, its severe current tearing through the flag's heart, picking out the perfect pitch and melody. A memory now, a still, framed, not revealing to the world what I had once seen. The panorama's generosity, its wild, stark untouchability, how each story stitched and preserved like the jewel in the lotus, its crystal fine edges caressed by petal soft skin, until everything folds inward like a fetus in a womb, a toppled, misplaced comma, my own implanted memory. And then they bloom, fanning outward, each flag, strand, story, each private grief and pleasure, chanting noiselessly in the mountains' silent winds.
Because you hear the sound of a lone rustling leaf, you hear the sea. Because I consider the sea silent, you hear its silence in my studio. And because of that, the silence will not empty the sea of its leaves. And because of that, the silence will not empty the sea of its leaves. Because you hear the sound of a lone rustling leaf, you hear the sea. Because I consider the sea
Thank you. It was a real pleasure to do this. I collaborate a lot with musicians and dancers. In fact, the next book is called The Whispering Anklet, Payal. And it's 35 years of my obsession with classical music and dance. And it's the book I've been wanting to, it's taken the longest time because every year I realize I know so much less than I knew about this because it's just such a vast field. But it's a poetic response to the text and the dance and so on. But I'll concentrate on this particular book, and I'll read a few poems and then we'll talk. I'll read the poem which you saw, the first film, That Is the opening poem of this book. And when I wrote the poem, I sent it to my son. And he said, "Oh, Baba, one more poem." And but he wrote back saying that, you know, I actually like it, but I have no idea what you're talking about. But I was at least happy that his creative or aesthetic nerves were tickled. And because we spent so much time on Zoom in the last 2.5, 3 years, this book initially was launched online. And the American musician and song composer Heather Ann Shepard, who did the poetry film and the singing and the composing, was following me on Zoom. And then she said, "I bought the copy of the book and I've selected 12 poems, and can I make songs out of them?" Of course, you're flattered, and you said, "Sure." And I haven't even met this lady yet. And the album is out on Spotify and YouTube and so on. And this was just an example of how someone else takes a piece of work which is so rooted in India and yet can universalize it because the message is of the essence. Then the essence is unshakable. But I'll just read it out to you because my son's birthday was just a few days ago, and that is for Arya. That is because you hear the sound of a lone rustling leaf. You hear the sea. That is because I consider the sea silent. You hear its silence in my studio. That is, and because of that, the silence will not empty the sea of its leaves. This one is called Disembodied, and it's set in Delhi, which is the city I was born in and grew up in and live in. And was written during the first wave. And of course, Delhi is also very, very polluted, and as an asthmatic, it's not easy, especially in the winter months, to live there. So it talks about climate and all sorts of things. I don't have to explain anything. Disembodied. My body carved from abandoned bricks of a ruined temple, from minaret shards of an old mosque, from slate remnants of a medieval church apse, from soil tilled by my ancestors. My bones don't fit together correctly as they should. The searing ultraviolet light from aurora borealis patches and etch corrects my orientation. Magnetic pulses prove potent. My flesh sculpted from the fruits of the tropics, blood from coconut water, skin colored by brown bark of Indian teak. My lungs fueled by Delhi's insidious toxic air, echo asthmatic sounds, a new vinyl dub remix. Our universe where radiation germinates from human follies, where contamination persists from mistrust, where pleasures of sex are merely a sport, where everything is ambition, everything is desire, everything is nothing, nothing and everything. white light everywhere, but no one can recognize its hue. No one knows that there is color in it, all possible colors. Body worshipped not for its blessing, but its contour, artificial shape shaped by Nautilus, skin moistened by L'Oreal and not by season's first rains, skeleton strength not shaped by earthquakes or slow molded by fearless forest fires. Ice caps are rapidly melting, too fast to arrest glacial slide. In the near future, there will be no water left or too much water that is undrinkable, excess water that will drown us all. Disembodied floats afloat like Noah's Ark. No GPS, no pole star navigation, no fossil fuel to burn away. Just maps with empty grids and names of places that might exist. Already, there is too much traffic on the road. Unpeopled hollow metal shells without brakes swerve about, directionless, looking for an elusive compass. I'll read one more poem and then we'll have a little chat. This one is called Om, a Ceremony. And it has an epigraph from Goethe, and I quote, architecture of frozen music. It also references and quotes a wonderful, wonderful Indian poet called Aga Shahid Ali, who's from Kashmir. He's no more, sadly, but you'll recognize the lines when I come to it. Om, a ceremony, and it's for all of us. In my city, I'm surrounded by constant cries of the dying, burning pyres heaving under burden of wood, smoke, and bones, wailing summed up by sonic notes of Om. Civilization's first sound, Sanskrit syllable echoing a conch shell's harmonic mapping, its involute spiral geometry holding within and emanating airborne sonar screams. My ancestors, grandmothers, mother, blew into the smooth shell cupped in their palms, held intimately, as if it was a talisman, a prayer, a pranayam in yoga's daily ritual. But breathing is such a privilege these days. Pandemic struck, oxygen deprived, my friends perish, the country buckles airless. Even an exquisite ceremony lacks the sheen or wax to rub the contours of a corpse now. Each day as I write endless condolence notes, etching dirge-like couplets on gravestones, my city continues to be dug up, to make space, not to make space for burial sites, but for palaces of illusion. An architecture of frozen music, greed, calumny. A country without a government, a country without a post office, Shahid laments. Let me cry out in that void, say it as I can, I write in that void. Om, celebration now, an unceasing requiem. Yet we chant in hope for peace. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti.
Thank you, Sudeep, for that wonderful reading and the films. Before I get into the few questions that we have, first of all, I would like to, just thank Lalit and you for not only organizing this festival, but also inviting us to be part of this. I think it's important that we have such festivals all across to discuss and ideate on various things. Since the theme of the festival is towards the essence, I think we are dealing with a very essential topic like climate change and our response to it, right? So in that sense, when we talk about climate change, the book also functions as a critique, if I may, of man's hierarchy in nature itself, right? So in that sense, as a poet, as a person who put forward this essential creative and political work, how do you think the imagination of human being itself has changed in response or in tune with the ideas of climate change and what we have to do going forward?
Sadly speaking, I don't think the imagination has changed that much. I mean, we are still talking about climate change, but something that scientists and historians and researchers have pointed out, but we still don't take heed. Part of the problem is the way the geopolitical matrix is constructed. There are countries which emanate CO2 and carbon imprint, maximum carbon imprint, are the same countries who are imposing sanctions on less privileged countries, saying, don't use coal, don't use that, So that's first set of dichotomy. The second set is, for me, writing about this was a source of sanity. Most writers and poets, we live a very isolated life in any case. I mean, I spend most of my time cooped up in a room, and apart from going for walks and doing chores for my household and neighbors, it's very, very internal in a sense. So one way of coping was to just write about what you see around you, make sense of it. And I feel deeply grateful that the gods that be allow us use our bodies to make us write through us. Sometimes I feel the poems I write are not even mine. They aren't mine, actually. I look at them and say, did I really write it? And in any case, when the book is published and it's out there and people have bought it, the work doesn't belong to you anymore. Often when you're doing poetry readings and you're with students and amateur poets, they read it and someone says, but this is not the way it should be. They'll often say, but I don't mean it like this. But the fact is, when the poem is flown out in the world, you're not there to defend it. It has to have its own wings or legs. Talking about wings, Lalit, you were talking about the bird needs both wings, and we don't understand what right wing is and left wing is, but that's another story. So partly it was to make sense, partly, about 15 or so years ago, I was just surfing the news channels, and I watch a lot of documentaries, and I just stopped on one channel, and the president of Kiribati, which is an island nation in the Pacific, was being interviewed by one of the big news channels, maybe BBC or CNN, I'm not sure. And the reporter asked him about some educational policies that need to be implemented and so on. And he was this very gentle, quite an Aurobindo-like visage person. He says, in about 10 years' time, all my countrymen and women are going to be homeless, because that particular atoll is only 6 feet higher than the Pacific. And at the level the sea levels are rising, he says, are you going to take all my country people in your country? And so on and so forth. There are places that are disappearing. My son's generation, I constantly hear this, and it's very, very disturbing and alarming. They all say that we do not want to have children because what is the world we are leaving behind for them? And we've created this. We have to take the responsibility. We have created this, and still, it's only COP 22 to 26 to 27 to 30th, and nothing really moves because the powers to be are not going to be moving things. We are still engaging in war. So many of the world is in conflict. But so what do you do? To create sanity, we have art, we have poetry, we have music.
Yeah, and also maybe not look at it as a crisis that is there for the future, but something that we are actually living through right now. So on that note, also this is perhaps one of the first and only full anthology as a full book that has responded to the idea of climate change. Of course, there has been a poem here, an artwork there, and maybe even a novel. There has been an after effect of climate change. So can you take us to the process of writing an entire book of poems just on climate change, and because it's also about the political imagery that you create through this, about refugees, about migrants, about people left behind. So can you take us through that process?
So yeah, this is the first single-authored book, creative book that has been written. Of course, a lot of books have come out by scientists and bureaucrats and technocrats and so on. But as from literature, there's a whole area of literature called eco-poetry, eco-literature, eco-criticism, and so on. It's a very odd thing to say. I didn't plan to write this book. I was working on the dance and music book. But this took over. There was this urgency that completely wrapped me in a sense that I did not have a choice. It got written. So in an odd kind of peculiar way, I say this book is a gift of the pandemic to me, but it's also, I feel guilty saying that because I lost 12 people during that time in Delhi. And how can a pandemic give you a gift? But you have to always look positively. So 2/3 of the book, the back 2/3 of the book is about hope, about consolation. And I'll just read the last quotation which I bookend, and that'll tell you why I wrote the book. This is a wonderful Polish poet called Czesław Miłosz, who won the Nobel Prize. And he wrote this in a different context, but it's still true. And he says, "My generation was lost, cities too, and nations. But all this a little later. Meanwhile, in the window, a swallow." So if we just look just in our own peripheral vision, there's a lot of positivity, there's a lot of good things that are happening, and those are the only forces that can ride through any kind of crises. So the book got written by someone else, but I didn't have a choice. And I'm glad I wrote it because, in a sense, often our books are trapped in English lit spaces. And I don't write for the academy or the critic. It's one more way of communicating for me. So when this book came out, climate organizations invited me to speak, and there were symposiums on the book where climatologists, social scientists, literature professors were discussing this. And that's the real joy I feel, because it actually is dialoguing with people across genres and fields and so on.
Yeah, it's heartening to see that it has taken like a life of its own, right? And another thing is that in this book, you have also used videos and multimedia images and a lot of things that kind of accentuate the ideas that you want. So do you think the idea of poetry has moved away or from the pure realm of imagination to something that needs to be supported through images and videos? Or can you take us through that?
Yeah, no, this is a multi-genre book, though dominantly it's poetry, but there's also prose poetry and reportage and photography. Side B of my life is as a photographer. And it has color photography in it. So I knew the moment I put it in, it's going to be very difficult to get it published because the publishers, of course, say 4-color printing, my God, you know. But I'm very happy that the publisher took it on board and did this book, because just poetry is one kind of rhetoric or voice or lyricism. It all the different kinds of things I was doing in different forms sort of come together in this book. And that's why people relate to it in different ways. You can dip in and out of this. But the meaning of poetry and the essence of poetry will never go away. You know, most of the time on our bedside table, it's usually a book of prayer or poetry that is there. We read the novels, then it goes onto the shelves, or we gift it to other people. And poetry, actually a lot of bad name to poetry is purely happened because it's taught so poorly in schools and colleges. I had a horrendous time. I had individual teachers outside class who were passionate about poetry, and my family was. But it was left to the last 2 days. You do fiction and you do everything, and then finally run through poetry. But think of poetry, it's actually the most essential things in our life. All the important moments in our life resort to poetry. Prayer, song, falling in love, falling out of love, birth of children, death, life. All the important things we have poetry. Classical dance and music is completely based on poetry that is sung aloud, syntactically and mathematically. Even if you want to be very, very generous, a lot of advertising jingles, however bad or good they might be, is based on a rhythmic kind of writing, which is poetry. So it's very much the core of our living, and actually poetry properly maps our inner breathing system. A lot of the dactyls and the iambs and the pentameters and the things we're talking about are actually originate from the whole idea of Om. It's breath pauses and how you calibrate sound. Just like photography is how you calibrate light, poetry is how you calibrate sound, and of course thought and other things are very much part of it. But I think we should end it here because it's the sort of topic which is so essential, we can go on and on. And we have a remarkable, remarkable young man who's going to sing, and I am completely in love with some of the dancers and musicians who performed in the last 2 days and some of the people I've met. It's been so enriching. So from poetry, we'll segue to Mahesh, and that'll be a wonderful way to end. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you, everyone.
You've been a very, very kind audience. Thank you, Abhay.